and start whenever you want.
Thank you very much. Well, let me just make sure we've got the screen shared and working first of all. And hopefully you're seeing my opening slide there.
Yep.
Yes.
Yep.
Okay, then I'll crack on. Well, I've called this, and thank you for, first of all, introduction. It'll just be one slide, really, which is my profile, and another slide that will show you my philosophy. I've always been really interested to know how other photographers think and work, because we all think and work slightly differently as much as we meet to learn from each other. So I think it helps to understand. And I hope there's something useful in action about the oceans and conservation. The main thing that fired me up in photography to work underwater, doing photography, and really to help the conservation efforts in oceans. So I'll show you what I've been doing with that, which was really my mainstream work. And I should say photography is a second career for me. But then what I've been doing more recently in the last few years is breaking out into new areas. I always want to try and create new work. I think it's good for all of us to try and do that. And I'll give you my ideas about how to improve your chances of creating new and different work, because I think novelty has a value all of its own in photography. It's almost an aesthetic of high value, because we all love to see inspiring new work. And I just wondered how you could create new things more often, because it's really quite difficult in one sense, because everybody's doing everything at the moment and sharing it all over the world. But I'll show you how I break out and innovate. And I have a really structured discipline for this now. And it's very high payoff. It's quite high risk because it doesn't always work, but it's very high payoff when it does. So for my profile, I'm a former chairman of the British Society of Underwater Photographers and chairman for much, much longer, but we have to change every 3 years. So I just stay in the background as a committee member now, but a very active one. I've published a couple of books, but for the pandemic would have already published a third. That will come back, I think, in due course. And I write still, I have done for a lot of magazines, mainly UK, Europe and North America, and a selection of them are there. They've all got a wildlife thrust of them, but also some academic journals. You'll see there the Cambodian Journal of Natural History, and I'll come back to a Cambodian project, a big one that I worked on. And I've had work in all of the UK broadsheets and a couple of times on the BBC. But I don't really want to say any more than that by way of introduction. I think what is really interesting for me is really how people approach photography. And I've tried to distill my approach in this slide here. And I think we all want to progress really from taking snapshots and good images to get into the admired and sort of stunning area. And hopefully now and again, one of us might get lucky enough to produce an iconic image. And for me, there are two axes to progress along here. One is the approach and technique, and one is artistic intent or your vision. And clubs, I think, like their International Photo Club, I think they're brilliant things, because I belong to lots of different clubs and organisations, some local, some national, some international. And that's where I get my inspiration from, and how I've really improved my work, by learning from others. So I know I've been crawling, of course, over your Facebook page and your website, and it's very clear you've got a lot of good photographers in there, and you have admired and stunning work. But I just encourage you to stay members of groups like this, because this is what works. It's how we quickly share ideas. But in pushing myself along that axis, I think what I learned fairly early on is the approach and technique is what most people concentrate on, and that share ideas for. But I'm rather more interested in the artistic intent and vision, and that was the subject of my second book, because I really wanted to get a grip of it. So composition is another way to put it. But if you can, at the end of all your study of the artistic side of it, start putting emotional impact into images, they will have more traction. And the interesting thing is this left-hand or vertical axis is much cheaper to invest in by a factor of 100. Typically, you know, it's about reading books and researching and sharing ideas, than the approach and technique, because although we need to do these things like early on understanding your camera, getting good exposure and focus, you're all way beyond that. But then getting into creative lighting, advanced techniques, and so on, you can get sucked into the equipment mangle and the belief that better equipment will make you a better photographer. And of course, some of you have already worked out it's not the case. But I have gear lust, just like any other photographer does. I'm always interested in new gear and what's going on. But this is a very expensive route to go down if that's all you invest in. And actually, the gearing, I think, is very high if you invest in the artistic side. So that's what I've really majored on in the past 5 to 10 years. But on the equipment side and the approach, I think another high payoff for me has been experimentation. I used to teach photography, underwater photography, and so few of my students do this, and so few ever became comfortable with it. And the reason is, when you experiment, you usually fail, and it's getting used to dealing with the failures. And I've always said, you know, some of my best images, and I'll show you one of them, at least in this presentation, the path to it was 1,000 failures, because most of what I was experimenting with did not work. But experimentation is a very high payoff strategy, is what I'm saying. So that's my approach in one slide. Lots of investment in the artistic side and lots of investment in experimenting and expecting to fail, but occasionally having some real spectacular successes. And I'll show you 2 projects where that happened. So a little bit about my ocean conservation work. So this became my mainstream work as a photographer. And it's a wonderful thing because I've traveled the world and dived in some amazing places, but it's always been with a view to producing imagery to support conservation. And there are some extraordinary things underwater. Here's a ship that was sunk just after it was sunk. I'm one of the very few people to have taken this picture before it fell on its side, got covered in corals. But actually it was sunk as a project. It was an artificial reef, so all the oils and fuels were cleaned from here, the electrical cables, it was made safe and sunk. And it is now an artificial reef covered in fish. I haven't been back to visit it because of the pandemic. I had planned to, but I want to go back and photograph it. But I photographed it just after it had been dropped into the ocean. And the interesting thing is that the world is littered with shipwrecks, and they're hugely interesting, both from a sort of maritime history point of view, but also a natural history point of view. Here's, and that was in the Cayman Islands. It was called the USS Kittiwake, the ship. This is the SS Thistlegorm. I don't know if any of you have heard of it. It's one of the most famous shipwrecks in the world. It's in the Gulf. It's in the Gulf of Suez. And it was a couple of Heinkel bombers in World War II managed to land a couple of bombs on this and sink it whilst it was still full of all its gear. It was on its way to support the North Africa campaign during the Second World War. So all that equipment is still packed in there, but now you can see it's covered in corals. Its anti-aircraft gun sadly lying on its side, having failed to take down the bombers. And you can go and dive inside this and it's like a living museum. It's extraordinary. But for me, it's just awash with life, and you get big stuff, small stuff. It's an amazing wreck to go and dive. And you find really interesting things inside it. And still, you know, way after 6 years later, here's a motorbike still cleverly packed into the hold, being covered in coral now. You can visibly see it's a motorbike still, and a raccoon butterfly fish swimming by it there. So, and it's packed, the holes are still packed with all the gear that never found its way to the North Africa and Italian campaigns. But I love shipwrecks because they have all this marine life on them. And I think UNESCO will tell you there are something like 14 million shipwrecks around the world. So there's plenty of them to go and dive. This is on the southwest coast of the UK. This is quite deep, so you have to do technical diving down to 60 meters to see things like this. I was writing an article about submarine warfare and also natural history, and it's a natural thing to want to go and dive on wrecks like this. But there are World War I and II submarines, quite a lot of them, around the UK. And you have to dive with great respect. These are war graves. there are still 30 German sailors on this particular wreck. So we dive with great care and respect for those that are still that lost their lives in this. But now you can see, of course, the sea takes everything back, and it's just awash with schools of fish and corals. So it has its own beauty, even though it was an instrument of war. But what I really love, I think, about the oceans is the natural life. And I love nothing better than to get onto coral reefs. And I was lucky, for the first time in a long time, I got back out to Egypt a few weeks ago and had a fabulous couple of weeks diving on the coral reefs again. And they just thrum with life. But they're under threat, of course. And I followed, and this is not experimental or new at all, my ocean work, early ocean work. I just wanted to photograph all the cool critters. This is a lionfish, an angelfish, and I think if you asked a child to produce a picture of a fish, they would do this and have outrageous colours and patterns. But these exist, and I was quite happy early on in my photography to just take standard photographs, portraits if you like, of these rather beautiful fish. But there's nothing new in this, and actually there's not a particularly high value in conservation taking images like this. It was more learning my trade at this stage. And there's the very small stuff. This is a secretary blenny living coral, and occasionally you can catch the character of them by catching them with their mouths gaping open, their eyes twisting towards you. So I think they're characterful little creatures. So I love the small stuff, and this is true macro work. But I love the big stuff as well. And this is a wrasse. It's a Napoleon wrasse. It's about the size of a decent dinner table, one of the biggest wrasses in the world. So I think it's quite good to go and photograph the big stuff. And then fish schools I love as well. A bit like murmurations of starlings and birds. Bird photographers sort of will get this. It's lovely to see fish all schooling together here. These are Indian mackerel filter feeding on plankton. And a school of barracuda off the, this is in Egypt, diving down onto the reef there. They make these beautiful shapes. I call this one barracuda vortex. But then naturally, as an underwater photographer, you get onto the big and exciting stuff. And this is a saltwater crocodile in Cuba. I was one of the first people to get in the water with these creatures. And it's done in a very controlled way with somebody looking after my interest, shall we say, here. And with a big camera in front of me, in case things do go wrong, the crocodile would have to get past the camera first, as it were. But it is very controlled, I do stress this. But I think it's quite nice to show an animal in a way you don't normally see it, because normally we see them on the banks or just eyes above the water. But I think to get these sorts of images in the water is quite interesting. And lots of people have been photographing these crocodiles since, and have got far better photos than this. And the sharks, of course, and the sharks really got me interested in conservation and reminded me why I wanted to be doing photography underwater. Because sadly, we, human beings, kill 100 million sharks per year, mainly for the Asian shark fin soup trade and oriental medicines. And it's absolutely disgraceful. And we are now removing the top predators from the ocean at an alarming rate. So some shark populations are collapsing. And I've worked with the Shark Trust and given them a lot of images to try and help promote the fact that sharks are not demons. And every headline you ever see about a shark in a tabloid newspaper tends to be about killer sharks and shark attack frenzies. And we've just had an incident out in Australia, but they're rare. Sharks kill about, on average, no more than a dozen people a year. And normally it's because people are misbehaving in the water or doing stupid things, or a case of mistaken identity. Given the numbers of people that go into the ocean these days, it's remarkable that not more are killed. But basically, that you're more at risk from domestic dogs and cattle in terms of being killed than you are sharks. Way, way more at risk. The biggest killer that people tend not to talk about, is a tiny little insect called a mosquito. Malaria, is the big killer in the world, not sharks. And yet sharks get demonized and they're being stripped out in the oceans. This is a nurse shark on a night dive in the Maldives that bumped me in the back of the head at night. And it's quite exciting. It does get your heart going when big, this is a 4 or 5 meter shark, sort of pushes you from behind at night. I defy anybody not to get their heart rate going up a bit. But they're not killers. It was just interesting, curious, and they'll nudge you and then go on their way. This is one of the sharks that's really suffering, and this is in the more dangerous category, because if you don't behave well in front of these sharks and do the wrong things, they can provoke attacks. But I don't know if the resolution is quite good enough on your screens, but if you look here, you'll see a fish hook in the mouth. This is an oceanic white-tip, and they are responsible for some shark attacks. But this is a shark that we're stripping out of the ocean more than any other at the moment, because they are curious. And they will come, and long liners take them, they're taken in nets, and they're taken for those lovely long fins that they have. And it is so sad. And again, you can see the fish hook in its mouth there. And this is a different shark, but nearly every oceanic white-tip I see these days, and I don't see many of them, it tends to have a fish hook in its mouth, which means that it's almost been killed. It just managed to escape. And these are blue sharks from the UK. These are photographed just south of Cornwall, and these are also under big threat now from the longliners. And they're beautiful plastic creatures. They're curious, they're insanely curious, and they'll come and nudge you and bump you, but they don't run up and bite you. They just want to know what you are. That's the equivalent to just touching you, putting hands on to find out what you are. But I really fear for sharks and have done an awful lot of work to try and help the agencies that are doing the protection work for them now, because we haven't got long left really to stabilise these populations. They're disappearing. And finally, silky sharks. These are photographed in Cuba. I love the silkies. They're also curious. Will come in very close. They love having their photograph taken. And the one on the left is the one, my favourite shark picture, which is why my publisher agreed to put it on the front of my book. So let me tell you about some more positive things that are being done in conservation. I'm going to tell you about two projects here. One is, top left is Cambodia. I did Fauna and Flora International I worked with. They commissioned me to produce a very big portfolio of 300 images of 3 different marine environments in Cambodia, because they wanted to create a case for a marine protected area. This is the thing that will save our oceans in the end, marine protected areas. And I did that work, and I'll come back to it. And it was successful in that it was created. There is now legal protection for that area in Cambodia, which was being destroyed very rapidly. But to see what good looks like, that was a few years ago, but not long enough now to know yet whether it's worked. But I'm pretty sure it will. But I can show you an area that was created 10 years ago in Mosul. It's at the center of this map here. It was on the point of total destruction when some people stepped in, the fishermen that were destroying it decided there was not much left to take and went away. So they created this tiny little area where there was some restricted areas, some no-take zones centered on Mosul. And it's been the most enormous success. Nature will fight back if you give her a chance. And in this little area that really, it was a shark finning station of all things. And the corals have been destroyed. All the fish have been taken out that were really worth anything. And that's when the fishermen decided to move on. And there was dynamiting, poisoning, all the destructive practices taking place. But today, and this was taken at Mosul, the coral has come back. You know, it took 10 years, but it has come back. And the reefs are absolutely humming with life now. It is the most extraordinary and heartwarming thing to realize that if you just let nature alone, it will take back control and it will rebuild the fish stocks. And the wonderful thing is, of course, everybody's profited. The fishermen who will fish in the restricted areas and just outside the totally protected areas are benefiting, because actually the fish are allowed to breed and the fish stocks grow on. It's fabulous. And a particular success story for me has been the manta rays there. I've never seen more manta rays in this anywhere else in the world. And they had all gone. Again, sadly, still to this day, these mantas, highly intelligent, beautiful big creatures. They're hunted for their gill rakers in the belief that it will help respiratory diseases, including COVID. I mean, it's a load of absolute hoop. And these wonderful, intelligent creatures are just slaughtered. But in Mosul, because it's protected now, they had completely disappeared. There were none left, or they'd gone out into the open oceans to hide elsewhere. Now it's protected, they've come back in numbers and they are thriving, and they will come and engage you at very close range because they're intelligent, inquisitive creatures. So it's a massive success story in Mosul. And I want to go back to Cambodia in 10 years after and just see if that has been restored in a similar way. I really hope it will be. So I'll just ask a rhetorical question: how much of our oceans are protected? My view is we should be protecting 30% of them by 2030, and that's the general aspiration for conservationists. The reality, I'm sad to say, is that only 4.8% of our oceans are actively managed, and only 2.2% are no-take zones. And yet where those no-take zones are created, the fishermen are thriving again, because of course the fish stocks build, the fish swim outside the areas, everybody wins. So it's a no-brainer, in my view, that marine protected areas are what we really need. So I work with organisations now like the Blue Marine Foundation, and I'll talk about one area in Ascension Island. But to come back to Cambodia, I haven't got time in this presentation to go through all the work. It will be a presentation in its own right. But the images that I took have been widely used by education agencies. There are lots of education programs set up in Cambodia now, learned journals, the people who are publishing the articles that are arguing the case for species protect on so and so forth. And then, of course, websites, books. But I'm really pleased it's a body of work I've created that is being used very vigorously and actively by Fauna and Flora International to make the case for the marine protected area, which is there now, and to sustain it and keep protecting it. So I think I've done no more valuable work in my life than that particular project. And in Ascension Island with Blue Marine did a very similar thing. This is now the biggest protected area in the Atlantic Ocean, and there are massive fish stocks there, which the Chinese were about to move in on and plunder because it had become, it's a long way away from anywhere, Ascension Island. It's in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, just south of the equator. But actually it wasn't commercially viable to go and fish there until fish stocks elsewhere were disappearing. And lots of people were planning to move in and plunder Ascension, but we got the marine protected area created just in time. And it's a very bountiful bit of the ocean. And I think just the final bit on the oceans, this image I like. This is my niece in a rock pool, but it reminds me of probably where all my energy came from as a youngster. My father used to take me rock pooling off the coast of Yorkshire, and we'd see starfish and blennies and absolutely love all this marine life there. And what I've started doing is trying to create images, recreate images that show this emotional connection. This could have been me sat gazing into a rock pool, many, many years ago. And that's what I want to do with these images now, is tell the stories and educate. So that's the oceans. So the last two things I'll go on to are more on the experimental side, but really the high payoff projects that I've done. One is in the rivers and the other is with bats. But one thing I had to do here, photographing naturally the underwater world, there were lots of conservation issues readily apparent in our rivers in UK. The water companies at the moment are just dumping raw sewage into UK rivers like you wouldn't believe. Every single river in the UK now fails its chemical tests. And it's all because we sold off the water companies to the Saudis, I'm trying to remember the other big company involved now, but basically it's just money making for shareholders. The government sold it all off. They don't care about anything other than making money these days for their mates and chums. So it came down to citizens to start protecting these waters. So I worked very rapidly with Wild Trout Trust. All of the agencies you see here do a lot of work with the Rivers Trust now. In fact, I'm now an ambassador for the Rivers Trust. But what I want to do is create good images in the rivers, of the good and the bad that's going on. But it became rapidly apparent I couldn't just get my dive gear on and go and dive. Rivers flow along at quite a speed. It'd be like diving in really difficult tides. So I thought straight away remote controlled cameras were probably the way to go. And also the subjects are very skittish. You get in the water, the trout and all the other things disappear. The water's also often quite turbid, so it's just all unsuitable for traditional underwater photography techniques. So I started experimenting. And this, I was working on southern UK chalk streams initially. It's much broader now, like the River Test and the River Itchen, so Hampshire sort of area. I've mainly been doing this work. And there are others, the River Colne, and this is near Fairford, and they're beautiful. These are pristine habitats. And the interesting thing is the UK owns 85% of the world's chalk streams. It's like the UK's rainforest, really. If we don't look after these, nobody else is going to. The world will lose them, not just the UK. So it seemed an obvious thing to get involved with. And I loved my fishing as a youngster. I loved rivers. My father used to take me to the rivers. And I wanted to do something about it. And this is where the experimentation idea came in. I thought, well, how do you photograph these river fish if you can't just get in with your traditional underwater camera? So I'll just sketch things, and these are the original sketches of two ideas I had. One was at the top there was a sort of broom handle that I would strap a camera onto the end of it, an underwater camera, a simple compact camera, and then use a brake lever and a wire to trigger the shutter. It was that straightforward. And at least I could stay back from the water and not scare the fish. And at the bottom, a rather more sophisticated idea to use a radio frequency trigger into an underwater housing. Interestingly, the one at the bottom, which I had high hopes for, I thought this would become my mainstream camera, it failed completely for reasons I won't bore you with, but it doesn't matter. I tried, it failed. The broom handle idea I've had huge success with, and I want to declare here that unlike my brother here in Spain, who's got a workshop to die for, I have it's what I call bike shed engineering. A pillar drill is the most sophisticated thing I have in my workshop. But using hand tools, saws, hacksaws, hammers, I build my own gear. So I built this thing on the left. In fact, it was a paint roller I used in the end, repurposed it and a brake lever to operate the shutter, and had amazing success with it. And with that simple idea to just dip a camera into the water and take a picture, I took this picture, and it won, it was a category winner in Underwater Photographer of the Year. So the system cost 300 quid to put together, camera included. But I had this idea, I'd seen the ducks and the trout, and thought if I could get a trout close to the camera, duck swimming overhead. And it was shooting blind, there's no viewfinder to look through here, so I just had to take dozens and dozens of photos and guess the composition, and eventually I got it. And so a really simple idea for experiment, and I've built on that and still use this kind of camera to this day in my work. So you don't always need the most expensive gear it's imagination, I think, goes a long way. But I did want to build on that, so I built a rather more sophisticated, or designed a rather more sophisticated housing to put it was then a Nikon D4 was the professional camera that I used. And the idea was to remote it to a laptop to get this in a housing, drop it into the river, onto the riverbed, and then step back and control everything live view through the laptop. So I'm sure some of you will have been involved with tethered shooting in studios, that kind of thing. Well, it's this kind of thing, but done underwater. And of course, you can stay warm and dry on the riverbank. You can photograph all day long. If you're diving with air cylinders, you'll get an hour maximum out of it. Now, my original housing, I have to say, almost flooded. I was using just this bike shed engineering. It doesn't have a lot of sophistication to it. So eventually I turned to a friend to engineer the housing exactly as I wanted it, to a higher standard. And here are some pictures of me working with it on the riverbank. That's the camera inside its housing. So, and then it sits on a simple scaffolding frame, and then it has commercial components to it. Of course, this is a glass dome to correct the optics for underwater. And then these are pictures of me deploying it onto the River Test in Hampshire. So it sits just below the surface there. And then I'm pleased to say I've been able to get a really good, strong portfolio of images that not many other people have done. There are a couple of lads doing similar work, but they would agree with me, I think, that I've managed to get higher, let's say, better quality images by getting away from the fish. They will come right onto the camera, and I use a bit of food to entice them very close in. And as a result, I've got a very good portfolio of images of trout, in this case, rainbow trout and brown trout. And the grayling, for those that know their fish. This is a split level image, half in and half out. And they've become very successful in the conservation game, showing the good of what happens underwater and what we've got to fight for in these chalk streams. And I'm pleased to say that very recently, only a few days ago, this image was awarded. It was runner-up in Underwater Photographer of the Year, British Waters Wide Angle category. This is good because it's always nice to have your work rewarded. But the reason I like to get into the competitions now is this gets a lot of profile, so I can write things about these images that are published all over the world, because this is you typically get 4,000 to 5,000 images from about 17 countries in these competitions. So you may have seen the winner was the whale sharks. It was very widely published. It was out on the BBC in the papers. But this was a category runner-up, and it gets a lot of traction. A lot of people get to see these images. So here are some more pictures of the beautiful grayling. Got this beautiful fin, dorsal fin. It's an underappreciated British freshwater fish. And I've done some close-up work as well. This took years to develop techniques. There's midge pupae, water boatman, and river fly. And the reason I'm photographing the small stuff in rivers is this is the bit of the food chain that suffers most through pollution, through sewage dumping and chemical dumping into our rivers. When these insects start failing because they suffer first, all the fish stocks will collapse very quickly on top of that, and all the other river life that depends on them as well. And otters depend on fish. It goes on and on and on. So the whole system collapses quickly if we don't keep the water clean. And the water boatman image was an award winner in Underwater Photographer of the Year a few days ago as well. But you have to photograph the bad as well. Conservation is not just about good pictures of good things, of beautiful things. It's about getting good pictures of bad things. So it's so sad. I'm sure it happens here in Spain as well. Everywhere I go these days, people casually dump their litter into our environments above and below water and bridges. I did a whole campaign with the local group to try and stop people just throwing their litter into the water. They think they've abrogated their responsibility because the water just carries their litter away. But you go and photograph near many bridges in the UK now, and there are beer cans, trash, bikes, shopping trolleys, you name it. And the picture top left is the water company just putting up a sign there, and it's all in very nice language, that lovely strapline, water for life. What that sign says is, we are dumping raw sewage regularly into this chalk stream. And it's outrageous, and it's illegal. It's absolutely illegal what they're doing. And the government will not prosecute them, well, until we started getting on their backs and on their case now. So we're doing a lot of work trying to stop this nonsense going on, because we are wrecking very slowly but surely every river in the UK at the moment. But there are some happy events around this. I have always, because I use high protein pellets to bring fish close into cameras, the ducks eventually worked this out. And I have this little group of ducks last year followed me around everywhere I went. They'd even follow me to my car in the car park at the end of the day in a nice, neat little line. But a colleague from the Rivers Trust took this photo of me giving them a little bit of food. But they're a nuisance because, as far as underwater photography goes, because they tend to mob the camera and they'll peck at my hands and head. So I call them the little monsters, and I would try and feed them and get them away from the cameras. But of course, there was always a chance to take some nice pictures. And this is a bridge where I do a lot of my chalk stream photography. And the little monsters would now and again pose waiting for their food. I got this lovely shot that was, again, this was awarded recently in Underwater Photography of the Year. And I've been able to put some big conservation messages on these images and get quite a lot of traction with them. So it's why it's good to have profile. But also, this is technically, you could all pull this image apart because of blown highlights. But this was a very well published image at the time. It's called Duck Photobomb, and it's a mallard duck diving in for a piece of food at the same time as a trout. I took a whole series of these images, and for some reason the public really engaged with them. And it doesn't matter if it works, it works. So I was able to, again, get people interested to click through, as they say, and then they would learn more about conservation in rivers because it was a novel and an interesting image. I'm just going to close this bit with a little bit about, this is me setting up. I don't know how well this will show on video. Zoom's not so good on the video, but you'll get the idea of me setting up the camera in very shallow water near the bridge you saw earlier. because I wanted to photograph ducks, so I put some birdseed on the riverbed to encourage what is quite natural behaviour. And this swan came along and preened itself, obviously wanting its photograph taken, and eventually went in front of the camera, and I managed to get quite a nice shot, which I'll show in a moment. But the swan also, I think the rig looked a little bit like another swan because it eventually started attacking it and trying to bite my flash to bits. So it does look, maybe the long neck of a swan is somehow sorted as a threat. But I managed to get a lovely image and to help tell the story of the water birds. We often see them above water. Swans are one of the most photographed birds in the UK, but people don't often show them in the other bit of their habitat. So this is encouraged natural behaviour, like a bit of birdseed on the riverbed. That's where they normally forage and feed. And it was just a different take, and it became a very popular image. Oh, and the final bit, sadly, this is where my river work got broken up with the pandemic. I was just starting a project to photograph salmon on UK rivers. It took 2 years to set this up. It's a very complicated project because of access. But I went to the top of this waterfall in the depths of winter to just do the studio setup ready for the spring run of salmon, and was hoping to show you salmon leaping through the air and also holding underwater at the top of the waterfall. So just imagine those fish. I will go back to this project at some stage if I can reset this up. But that was the sort of getting ready to set that shot up. And that's when, for me, COVID struck and I had to pack the whole project in, and nothing happened for 2 years. But maybe I'll come back to that. So that's my artistic intent, to show Atlantic salmon fighting their way up Scottish rivers. So imagine a couple underwater there and a couple leaping through the air, and you'll have the end picture. So we're doing fine for time. So this is the final bit. And this is about bringing innovations into the world of bat photography. And this came out of river photography, in that I saw a bat, a tiny little bat, taking insects off the water surface at dusk, whilst just after I was finishing a day's river photography. And I thought that will be a hell of an image to take. And I had no idea how difficult it was going to be. But it was an absorbing and really interesting project, which I'll take you through now. So I thought it'd be as simple as just setting a camera up at water level, one of my underwater cameras, and snapping the bat as it went by. Oh my goodness, it proved to be a lot more difficult than that, for all the reasons you might imagine. So technically, I mean, you're photographing in the dark or very low light. These bats typically fly along at an average of about 11 meters per second. You can't autofocus on them. I did try doing things like that, but it needed a camera trap type setup, I thought. So this project was about continuous problem solving, and I also dived into the world of infrared. Because bats are protected species, you can't disturb them, and therefore I did some work with the Bat Conservation Trust, and they agreed that low light and infrared were the way to go. And this involved balancing cameras on tripods in water, at water level. It was quite an exciting thing to do in the black of night. You need to, safety alone was a bit of an issue. But that's an infrared selfie I took with the camera set up, ready to go. And lots of failure. This was where you have to expect to fail, to experiment, and just move the project on. And I don't have time to walk you through all the technical detail, but just I'll give you a flavour that I had to really understand where the bat, what was the best spectrum to work in. This is how infrared and out. But I had to really begin to understand light in a way that I had not understood it before. So to really understand the spectrum end to end, including UV and infrared. And it's a really interesting exercise to get into. And then looked a lot at bandpass filters. I'm sure some of you will have dabbled with infrared for landscape photography. It's a very popular genre of photography, but this needed an even deeper dive. So I had to modify cameras and modify flash guns to emit in the right and catch light in the right spectrum. And then I used some commercial devices. The light shaping becomes very important. And I used some homemade devices here, snoots and bandpass filters strapped onto normal flash guns in order to work in the infrared range. And these are some of the rigs I knocked up. Again, this is bike shed engineering, that a mix of commercial cameras and rigs modified in order to really work in the infrared and low spectrums. So that's just what they look like. Or that was for wide angle photography. And this is a little video of me setting up a laser camera trap. I very quickly realized that to catch these bats over water, you would have to set up a laser trap, so the bat will fly through, the laser will trigger first of all the camera and then the flash guns, because it was the only thing I found that was quick enough, because they're moving so quickly, to actually get an instantaneous trigger. So it's quite a complicated little setup, and years worth. It took 14 months to get the picture, and I've been working on the project for about 3 years total now. This is what the setup looks like. So for a head-on shot of a bat, I set something up like this. So here's the camera that will take the shot on a tripod just above water level. And at the far end is the trap. So that there's a laser beam. Imagine, you'll see more detail in a moment. There's a laser beam shining just above the water. In fact, there's a couple of laser beams. And the bat will fly. I've worked out where the bats are flying at night. There's lots of insect activity here on this particular lake. And they'll fly towards the camera, hit the laser beam. One laser will open the camera, the next will fire the flash. And it becomes a bat selfie, in fact, because the bat takes the picture of itself as it flies through.
Amazing.
If you look at the other end of the rig, so this is the bat's eye view. The red arrow is where you were just looking from. There's the camera and the flash gun. So here's the trap end of it. And what you have here are the other two red arrows to the left are the two lasers. And the first one fires a beam. The bat doesn't see it, and neither does the human eye. Actually, you see a red glow at the laser. You see nothing in the airspace. This is just illustrating the path of the laser. And these are just little mirrors and blobs of plasticine angled to create this grid. So what I know is going to happen in this area is the bat will swoop down towards the water. It'll fly through this grid. It's designed so that it will always trigger as the bat comes down to the water. That will open the camera shutter, pre-open the camera shutter. It's in the dark, of course, so initially there'll be no image registered. But then further down, there's a laser beam over the water, and this is where you hope the bat will take insects emerging off the water, and that will trigger the flash, and the flash will create the picture. So that was, well, I say a relatively simple setup, but they became more sophisticated than this. There was one bat I decided to call Tom Cruise, because a bit like Mission Impossible, somehow it managed to keep flying through here and never triggering anything. So it was flying below the beam, above the beam, through the beams. But the majority of bats would, and you just have to wait for a bat to come through in the right area. You can't make it happen. So this is why it took so long. You can't stage the shot so accurately. I know lots of bats fly here. I know lots of insects come off the water here. So you just have to set it up and hope it will fly through in the right direction. But eventually one will. And this is a documentary picture of the bat as it actually hits the laser beam. And you can see the flash going off there. And just to the right, you'll see a little red dot. That's the mirror reflecting back the beam that's coming over the water. And my artistic intent here was to create spectacular images of British wildlife in a way that others had not. And I wanted to express speed of movement and hunting like that. And it did take that 40 months to get an image that eventually won the British Wildlife Photography Awards. So you will, I think, all understand this, but this is how I managed to get creative combinations. So rear curtain flash, I'll just remind you, because I'm sure you know it, you're all experienced photographers. The shutter opens, and however long the shutter dwell is, then the shutter closes, and the flash will fire as the shutter closes. This will become important to understand why I'm reminding you of this later. You can use front curtain flash, where the shutter fires immediately you hit the trigger, and then the shutter will stay open for however long you've programmed it and capture residual light. But also, as you'll see in the images, I used repeating flash a lot, or strobe flash, where you would fire, say, for example, 5 shots at 10 hertz, 10 cycles a second. So you just get this pop, 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 pop of the flash repeating. And The other really interesting thing I experimented with and eventually managed to control was ambient infrared. So this was a security light, typically. So I just would shine infrared light over the surface of the water. And it's invisible to the human eye, but you can see it in the infrared spectrum. And by using different combinations of rear curtain, front curtain, repeating flash and ambient infrared, I managed to get some really interesting creative possibilities. So let me show you the images that came out of this. So this is a rear curtain flash with ambient infrared. So what's happened here is that I've opened the shutter. The trail of the bat's body, and you can just about see the wing beats, are shown. As soon as the shutter opens, you get this blurry effect. And then the flash fires just as the shutter closes, and then you get the picture of the bat frozen in time, because of course the flash dwell is in milliseconds and it just freezes the bat. So even if you open the shutter for 5 seconds, it wouldn't matter. It will still freeze the image. So your flash speed becomes your shutter speed, if that makes sense. But that's a combination of rear curtain flash and ambient infrared, and it shows this movement of the bat over time. This is a front curtain flash with ambient infrared, and again, if you get lucky now and again, you can see the insect in this shot as well. So the flash fires immediately, and it freezes both the insect and the bat at that moment in time. But then the shutter stays open, and the ambient infrared paints the bat's body movement and its wing beats. And you know that the bat caught its meal in this case because the insect flight path stops where it intercepts the bat, or the bat intercepts the insect, and then the bat continues, the insect does not. So he got a nice little meal on this occasion. And then repeating flash with infrared. So this is just one bat and one insect in this image. But at the points where the flash goes off, you see different, you can see the insect. On the high resolution image here, you can see the wings, the antenna and everything. This was with, I think, a D850 or D800E, very high resolution camera. And you see the bat at different stages of flight, and the ambient infrared paints in the rest. So you can even see the wing beats of the insects here. And again, you see that the bat catches the insect because the bat flight path continues, insect doesn't. And it's not a particularly beautiful images, but these have a scientific value as well, as the many bat scientists I've worked with tell me. But these are the creative possibilities with different ways of thinking. And then if you take away the ambient infrared, you can just strobe flash only. This is one bat, but you can see its flight path over time as it swoops onto the water and then lifts back off again. And this is a long, so this is a 1 second exposure, and that's long enough to gather the ambient infrared to highlight the trees, to backlight the trees there. So it's another nice way, and I like the reflection in this image as well. So that's a converted Nikon D750 and a Nikon Speedlight. So 7 cycles at 10 Hertz, so it's fired 7 times at 10 times a second. That's repeating flash only. And then some low light photography. So this is normal light. This was using a laser trap. This is a Dobbenton's bat. And it looks a little bit scary. You know, bats aren't these terrifying creatures that some people think they are. They echolocate, so the bat sees at night by transmitting its voice. It uses ultrasound. So all the bat is doing here is trying to see what's ahead of it to navigate to catch insects, which is why its mouth's open. It's not coming at you to bite you. They do have a bad image, like sharks. Bats have been given a bad image mainly through Dracula and all of that. And it's a serious part of trying to, not demonize the bat. This is an infrared image of 2 bats hunting at night. One flew through the trap, and it happened to have a buddy coming in behind it. I really quite like that. And this is a bat pushing the insect into its mouth just after it's caught it on the water's surface. And that's a Dobbenton's bat. And then I used a double exposure. You can't create that image for real because you can't have the depth of field necessary, but I basically took one picture to get the bat coming through the photo trap, refocused on the moon just peering through the clouds. And that was an award-winning image. I mean, I don't like the lighting so much in this particular one, but it was another way of creating a sense of the bat. It flies at night. Part of its environment is moonlight. And then by using long exposures and repeating flash, could get the sort of natural light coming in at dawn and dusk. I found were good times to photograph bats flying through environment, because you're trying to show environment, water, woodland, insects, and the bat flying through. And I like this one because it shows it has an environmental story. You know, you've got the big metal birds flying overhead. These are the Heathrow flights getting airborne early in the morning. They happen to fly over this particular lake, and I wanted to show the tiny little bat hunting in its fragile atmosphere. And here's all the CO2 being pumped into the atmosphere, which is a big issue, you know, for many, many reasons. But the habitat is under threat from carbon dioxide. And then some really creative stuff I started doing, which is double exposures. And this is a handheld camera, just twisting and deliberately moving the camera to sort of blur and try and get a more artistic effect into the image. And I think it's a bit of a Marmite image. Some people like these images, some people don't. But I find them quite an interesting exercise. And then this is a de Benton's bat swooping down onto the water to take its insect by using strobe. This is, I love the mirror image here, which is so flat, the water that evening, not a ripple of wind on it. You get almost perfect reflection, and you can just see it putting its feet into the water, or about to scoop an insect, which is just echolocated at the water surface. These bats take these insects off the water surface because that's a moment of high vulnerability for the insect. It's static at the water surface, trying to free itself from its shuck before it flies when it's harder to catch. So they've got little feet, they're like hobbits. They've got the slightly bigger feet than most bats, and they're hairy feet in order to catch these insects off the water surface. And this is one, it's very lucky it's suddenly seen a big, I think it's a crane fly or a caddisfly coming off the surface. You don't see many of these, or as many as the midges, but it's nice to get the bat homing in on a big meal as well. And that was the image I wanted to recreate. I saw this when I was finishing the trout photography one evening. That's the picture I saw, the bat diving onto the water surface to catch an insect. But it took a long time to eventually get that image and take it. In fact, it was nearly 2 years before I got that particular shot. And that's a more 3/4 view with some backlighting to try and help the wings. I've never, still to this day, I've not got the lighting right for these images, but they're coming along. And I'll do another year's work with this year. And that was the image that really made it for me. And it was a world first. I think you've got to be very careful saying things like that, because somebody will come back and say, well, actually, I've already done it. But I certainly haven't, I couldn't find a single published picture of that quality that showed bats hunting over water at night in the infrared spectrum, because it shows the flight path. I happened to be, I was lucky, got the insect in the shot as well. So it's a good action shot, and that's the one that won the British Wildlife Photography Awards, which was great. And that allowed me to get into all sorts of other work. So finally, just a tiny little segue. I know we've at least one astrophotographer in the audience. One thing I thought would be really interesting was to improve the overall image, to get better bat backgrounds, as I call it, was to bring the stars in. So moon is part of the environment, but the moon's always very bright, and it's really hard to manage an exposure with the moon in. But starlight is much fainter, and it's much more compatible, in my view, with these images. So you can look at maybe 2 to 5 second exposures where you can get both the bat and the stars coming in. So I thought I'd have a little excursion into astro. Did what many people have done. I started taking pictures of the Milky Way in different environments, and imagined that I would then have bats flying through the environment. But I sort of did just a little bit of work, but it became fascinating in its own right, and really got my hands firmly into the equipment mangle. And you have to get into special cameras for astro. But what I found is you can, and I've done the top center sort of rig there, that's a standard camera lens with astro camera fitted. And I've got plans this year to really now just about nailed the astrophotography, or I've got a better understanding of it. I want to go further with it yet, but I want to bring high quality astro imagery and bat photography all together in one, but it'll probably be with a wide-angle lens, a normal wide-angle camera lens, an astro camera, and a star tracker, which is the thing on the right. And this is what I've just brought out to Spain to practice with for a few weeks, to really track the stars throughout the exposure. So you don't get this blurring of the stars, because you want pinpoint sharp stars, and then start lighting up with infrared as well to get the bats in the picture. So it's quite a complex project, but I've got a beautiful final image in mind. But it led me, of course, and this COVID sort of fixed me to my own back garden. So I thought, well, why not take some deep space photographs with long lenses? So I started with long lenses and then eventually bought a couple of telescopes and have started taking pictures of distant galaxies, which I found fascinating in its own right. Don't imagine these overlaid with bats, it would be completely unrealistic, but this is just a bit of a segue. And I was talking earlier about M42 or Orion, but this is taken with a standard camera lens but a star tracker to get the length of exposure that you need for these images. And beautiful things out there. This is the Rosette Nebula. It's a 400mm lens is all you need to photograph this sort of thing, but also you need to track the stars for sufficiently long exposures. And I've started looking with narrowband filters at these as well. This is the same nebula, but looking at specific tiny narrow bands of the spectrum to see effectively different false colors. But I think there's enormous potential here to look at all sorts of things. But to go back to where I started, what I want is that kind of picture with the bats hunting insects. Meteors going through, that's quite easy to do when you know where the meteors are. If you get set long enough exposure and take enough pictures, but also I'd probably imagine a really good Milky Way sort of background rather than just a few stars that you see there. So this project has some way to go yet. And it did lead to, when that image was published of the bats hunting over the lake, it got me working with my local bat groups, and I've been helping them do their scientific work. And the wonderful thing for me is I can now see these little creatures close up. So this is licensed work handling bats. They are protected species, but I've been documenting them and seeing these bats that I only ever saw as these tiny little creatures frenetically flying around. I've now seen many of the species close up as the bat workers have done their work. So I've been documenting for them, and they love the fact that I've got infrared cameras. You can take flash photos at night that they don't disturb anybody, don't disturb humans, don't disturb bats. So I always photograph the bats being released back into the wild when they finish their work, and inevitably end up working with the Bat Conservation Trust and other groups with their publications. The very final story I'll tell is just a quick thing about radio tracking an elusive and rare bat. This is in Savanac Forest. And there is a species called the barbastel. Very stealthy, fast bat, very rare now. It's a moth hunting specialist. It's extinct already in some European countries, but we have a few left in the UK. And what the scientists did was let me go join a radio tracking team. So they radio tagged a bat, they caught it in a net, radio tagged it and tracked it back to its roost. And I had the great joy, and I haven't got the time now to show you all the imagery, but in that I set up infrared cameras and filmed these bats coming out of their roosts at night. And under that little red circle on the left lower image, you'll probably just see the eye and forelegs and head of the bat coming out at night. These are female, it's a maternity roost, so these are female bats with their pups. And I've actually got a film of a bat carrying its pup underneath it. They're about the size of a 2p piece, if you remember what that old currency was. Anyway, there we go. So I got to see a very rare bat and film it in the end. I think because I don't want to drag on for too long and leave a little bit of time for questions, I'll conclude with that. But I think I have to go back to the main thrust of this, that all this work sort of comes back to conservation as far as I'm concerned. That's what my imagery will always be doing. No matter how creative and complex it's getting, it will come back to creating images that will help conservationists do what they need to do to protect the animals and their habitat. Okay, I'll stop sharing it at that stage, and perhaps if there are questions, I will take them now.
Well, first of all, let me say, Paul, that was brilliant. Yeah, beautiful imagery and very interesting. the whole structure and the effort put into it. Yeah.
Thank you. Very kind.
Yeah, very excellent.
Yes, fantastic. Thank you.
Very good.
Yeah.
Paul, do you get frustrated by the lack of response of the UK government to preservation issues?
Yes, I do. Very. Who is it? Ashton, is that? Yes, they drive me to distraction. But I think you can have many responses to this. I mean, I write regularly to my MP about many issues. Conservation is one of them. But I think you have to, as a responsible citizen, you have to try and get the machinery that's supposed to look after this, which is the Environment Agency, therefore the government. There's a question about funding and all the rest. But because the response has been so poor, and because there is so much interest in the profit of water companies, for example, vice what really should be happening, which is, instead of generating money, they should be building infrastructure to, so that they don't have to dump raw sewage in that particular case. So, but because the government frustrate me and they're not really seriously interested in this, they make all the mouth music, but there's no action. You have to then sort of think, okay, what can be done? And, I found, and it's really heartening, it's sad it has to go this far and the environment has to be so trashed before these things start happening. But it's amazing when you start working in local groups, and that's what I found the most effective, is get engaged with local groups. I'm members, I work with local back groups at a sort of county level. So I've got, and sometimes go right down to parish council level, but people who you can face to face with locally, who actually live in the environment. They're not detached in Westminster or claiming that they understand their constituents. These people are actually directly involved. They will do stuff, and you can do a remarkable amount at local level. So I am very much a local activist, or those are the groups that I go and offer my services to. And I will work for free for good environmental groups. So some things I can't afford, and I will ask for logistics support. But generally, my time as a photographer for conservation groups, it will be pro bono. They'll normally take me up. And then, in fact, I was talking to my sister who's online listening at the moment. She and I both noted that there are people, there's a guy called Fergal Sharkey. I'm sure we're all at that age where some of you will know him. Fergal Sharkey, if you can find a celebrity or a name who has a big following on social media has enormous traction. Now, he's got a big following on Twitter. He happens to be interested in rivers because he's a fisherman, and he's got resources because he made money as a pop singer. But he's a plain speaker and a great campaigner, and he has taken government on face to face and really embarrassed the ministers. And what the ministers and the Prime Minister hate is social media going wild with bad news. And through these groups, and if you can find the right frontmen, and Fergal Sharkey is one of the best frontmen I've seen for these issues, because he won't take no for an answer. He's so tenacious. And on the sewage issues and things like that, through local environmental groups, he's got the government on the rails now. And actually the whole rivers thing is starting, the sewage dumping has become a bit of a national shame. But it's not because the government have brought this to any highlight, but because actually the public and local groups are campaigning vigorously for their patch. So I think, despite my frustrations with central government, it's not happening top down. What's happening is there's a bottom-up environmentalist sort of groundswell, and you really can have a huge impact here. And it's coming back at the government through social media, and they're being shamed into doing better things. But it's a slow process, and the sad thing is you have to get to the point where the environment is under serious threat, and of course it's a huge risk. They should be doing it proactively. So it's a long answer, but in short, yes, I'm hugely frustrated, but it's not going to stop me getting at them in any way that I can. And I found that the combination of local groups, social media, and good frontmen are absolutely invaluable. There are plenty of people, Phil Sharkey, who will take up the cause. I'm trying to think of another a great actor who's got a very big name. He's just taken up on the oceans thing through Greenpeace. His name will come back to me. There's a Simon Pegg, very good, played a lot of comedy roles, but he is doing amazing work with Greenpeace. And there are lots of socially responsible celebrities, really. And I don't mean celebrities in the worst sense, people who just want to be famous because being famous is important to them. It's people who have sort of done the hard yards, had successful careers, and now they're looking for things to do with their time and resources. And they're far more effective than any minister. But you have to shame the ministers because they've got the levers of power.
Are you able to leave your kit in the setup in place overnight, or do you have to set it up each day because it's in a vulnerable location?
Very rare in some protected areas, and on private land, and I can do that. That's my idyllic sort of setup, but it's quite rare. I just wrote an article for my in-house magazine for the British Society of Underwater Photographers, where I opened the article with stories of the 3 worst things that have happened to me whilst out doing this stuff. And people will steal and trash and do awful things to your gear. I mean, I've had some awful confrontations. I'm not a confrontational person, but I will protect my gear and I will protect the environment. But I've seen some shocking things going on, so I'm not inclined. And there's a big problem with poaching, for example, on rivers. And poachers, if people are in there for nefarious reasons, stealing fish from places they shouldn't steal them, and they happen to see a nice rig or whatever in there, they'll probably help themselves to it. So I generally won't leave stuff unattended. But I have done it, and it is useful to do it. I would love to be able to set, one of the most productive bat areas that I work at is also a drug dealing area. It's on the outskirts of Swindon. And I mean, there are some very funny stories to tell out of this. I won't bore you with all this now, but essentially I would never leave my gear unattended there because there's all sorts of shocking stuff going on. And it's an interesting thing. The one thing I will tell you is that at night, when your vision is denied because it becomes completely dark, your other senses, so your sense of smell, your sense of hearing actually increases. So, and I hear things going on the far side of this lake because voices travel. And with acute hearing at night, I mean, I would blush to tell you some of the things I've heard going on around this lake at night. But those are the places I would never leave my gear, much as I would love to, because actually, once you've set a photo trap up, I'd love to go and get some sleep. But all the time it's running a back trap, it'll normally be attended. Because I fear, and people have tried to jump in the water and mess around with it. Yeah, sadly, these are minorities, I must stress. The vast majority of people I meet when I'm out and about doing environmental work are utterly brilliant, interested people who are genuinely supportive. But there's this minority, little outing few who absolutely is such a risk. So generally not, is the answer.
Can I first of all say how much I've really enjoyed your presentation, Paul? When I'm just curious, when were you in Missoul? How many years ago?
2000 and it's not that long ago. I would say it's about 4 or 5 years ago.
Okay, because I haven't been to Missoul, we didn't get there, but I was up in Raja Ampat for about 4 or 5 years ago and went diving with the manta rays with my little point and shoot camera. Fabulous part of the world.
Oh, Raja is lovely. Yeah, it is. It's heaven on earth for anybody who loves the oceans, and you obviously do. Yeah, yeah, and I think an encounter with a manta ray or a whale is one of the most extraordinary things you can do underwater. When they come in close and they come inches away from you and eyeball you, I mean, it's just that'll keep you going for years.
Yeah, for years. Yeah, no, fantastic. They were all coming and getting cleaned by a rock when the fish were picking off all the whatever to clean them. Absolutely, but brilliant corals and underwater stuff there now, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm just curious because I not many people you run into who've been over to that part, yeah? I enjoyed very much your presentation and thank you.
Well, thank you.
I remember a few years ago in Scotland, a person that was working with bats got bitten and died from rabies. Is there still a rabies population in the UK?
Yes, it's quite a low threat these days. Who's that? Was David. The bat workers, so my colleagues who work in the Wiltshire Bat Group and the national bat groups, they're inoculated against rabies because of that risk, and wisely so. For me, because I don't handle bats, they did offer, they wanted me to become a full-on bat worker, but it would be, I argued that would stop me doing what they really want me to do, which is to get the photography work done. So, I'm in very close proximity to the bats, but I won't handle them. If they did say, if I got into that full-on handling, and I would love to handle one of the creatures, I did have this burning desire to, pick one of these creatures up and look at them really, really closely. But they said you would have to be rabies inoculated. So it's still around, yeah. The chances of, one flying, people talk about, there's all sorts of nonsense about them. They'll get tangled up in your hair, they can't sense your hair. It's rubbish. It's absolute rubbish. Yeah. And if one flies, and they do occasionally fly into bedrooms and so on, the answer is you phone the Bat Conservation Trust, somebody will come and remove it for you. Don't try and handle it yourself, or open the windows and hope they fly out. But they don't, they won't come up and get you around the neck and give you rabies. They just don't do it. No. They're terrified of us.
How does it remain in the bat population, not transfer to other animals?
I don't know. I mean, interestingly, well, of course, they're mammals. And of course, COVID, there's been a lot of misinformation about bats and COVID. I think my reading of it from the scientific articles I've read is that China has put a lot of misinformation about the Wuhan market thing. This probably came from, not from Wuhan COVID, but from bat, and it may be part of the bat gene pool in some caves way in southern China. I mean, my guess, and but there's a lot of evidence that I've read suggests that actually that virus was brought from the bats into a laboratory in Wuhan, and it escaped from the laboratory through poor control. But the Chinese have completely clamped down on that, and there's a bit of a misinformation story about the pangolins and all the rest of it. I think, I mean, it's very hard to tell because the Chinese locked down so hard on this. But bats do, because they're mammals, I don't know if you suggest, would they pass it through cats, dogs, and other things? I just don't think they have those interactions with those creatures because of the nature of the bat and how it operates. And they generally stay away from other things. There are other parts of the world, I mean, there are vampire bats, true vampire bats, of course, do bite other animals. And that could pass, will pass other diseases on. But I don't know enough to tell you sort of the definitive answer, I don't know. But I do know that because they're mammals, their diseases are relatively easily transmitted across. But that's always been true, and not just of bats, of all other mammals as well. The biggest risk now, actually, is the reverse. Because COVID has been through the human population so thoroughly, the bat workers stopped handling bats because the fear is they'll decimate the bat population by putting COVID the other way around into the bat population. So my colleagues have not been allowed to handle bats for this past 2 years, except in extreme circumstances where they take great care. Yeah, because the fear is it will go the other way. It's the bats that are more threatened by us now than we are by them. But I think there's a lot of misinformation around about how the diseases are being transmitted, mainly due to China's misinformation campaigns.
By the way, your talk was excellent. So.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, once again, Paul, thank you very much. That was very interesting, very well put together, and some beautiful imagery there. Yeah, that was a very enjoyable presentation. And hopefully you'll be able to come back again when you've done a few of those things that you said you were going to do, and show us some more.
Oh, very happily. In fact, I see I'm looking out the window here, and the skies begin to open up. So, of course, I'm rather hoping to go back to UK with some lovely astro that was taken in Spain. That will further develop my understanding of astro, and hopefully some of the bigger images that I want to go back and create, which is the Milky Way shot of the bats. Bats flying through that lovely habitat, but with the Milky Way revealed as part of the natural scene. So yeah, I hope this little visit to Spain will help get me some good gearing for those shots. I'm also, because again, my sister's on the conference call here, she's very interested in bird photography. So I've brought, but she hasn't got a super long lens, so I brought my big gun out with me. I've got a 600, which I can extend to about 850. Because you've got birds out here that I would die to see, the golden oriole, and which I've been wanting to see one of those since I was about 8 years old. So I'll be doing a bit of bird photography as well. So anyway, hopefully
Dave, you should talk to Dave and Emilio about the bird photography. They're both pretty expert.
Well,
and Trevor about the night photography, about astrophotography.
Yes, in fact, we had a quick chat at the beginning. Yeah.
I have a golden.
I think Paul's the expert, not me.
I have a golden oriole nest up in the woods behind me.
Yeah, but you're working on it. You're working on it, Trevor. You're getting there.
I'm a bit behind on the kit front. I think it's my problem.
But that's what I probably thought, Trevor.
But I should give myself a bit of a kick in that case then, because I did argue it's not all about the gear; it is about the artistic vision. But actually, it's amazing what you can do with a regular camera body, and you have got a Star Trek, haven't you? And I will be doing some regular camera, regular lenses, and I've got a little Star Tracker. I showed the big thing. I've got one that fits in the palm of my hand, and I'm going to be doing some wide-angle shots while I'm here of the Milky Way. And what you do have here, I mean, even this local area is better by a factor of 10 on light pollution than where I'm back home. I live in a rural area, and I can get reasonable quality astro, as you've seen. But here it is a factor of 10 better, even with the local light pollution that you do have. I mean, I know that there are truly dark skies in Spain, but I'm not sure I'll be ranging out to those areas. But I think you have amazing opportunities right here on the doorstep.
Whereabouts are you in Spain at the moment?
Judy, you'll have to pitch in because I can't tell. My sister will pitch in and tell you exactly where we are, because I only arrived late last night and I'm still not sure. Your audio is not live, Judy. No, I'll open the door, then I can hear you and I'll relay. Go on. Oh, of course, Turry. Not far from Turry. T-U-R-R-E.
Oh, well, yes.
Oh, that's close. That's close.
Just a few kilometres up the road from me.
Mm-hmm.
The Cabo de Gata area is pretty good.
Right.
Just get a little bit of height above the sea mist, but then you've got effectively the Mediterranean to the south before you get any real light pollution. But you can see the light pollution from North Africa from there.
Oh, I'm absolutely sure with long enough exposure. I mean, it's remarkable. I went to the darkest area I could find in Scotland, and it was Glasgow. It's amazing how far north that light pollution reaches on a long exposure. But you've just got to learn to live with it and control it. But no, that's great. Thanks. So Cabo de Gata, what did you say? Cabo de Gata.
Cabo de Gata.
Cabo de Gata.
It's a national park.
It's about 50 minutes from you in Turry.
Brilliant. Brilliant. Thank you. No, well, I'll definitely get down there one night and do some wide-angle stuff.
Yeah, no,
I'm planning to get out for the dawn with or the pre-dawn with the Milky Way Centre.
Okay, well, brilliant. Yeah, so hopefully I will have something to show you next time round.
Okay, folks, you had a flat tire, Emilio.
I'm sorry. I was in Sierra Cabrera in a Rambla taking photos of orchids and a flat tire in a place without a signal, no phone signal, and then, oh, crazy. There's nothing to do, just changing the tire and going fast to home, but not at time. Sorry, Paul, I thought was very interesting your talk. I will see it by the record one.
Yeah, it has been recorded. Yeah.
It's a pity for me. It was very, yes, it was
I'll get that to you, Frank. Frank's gone.
Yes, could you get it before Wednesday if possible? Because I'm going to be leaving on Wednesday for a couple of days to Valencia. And so I won't be able to upload it until I'm back in the weekend. So either before that or it will only be up next Saturday. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'll try and get it to you tomorrow. Yeah.
Thanks.
Paul, if you're into rarish birds, there's a couple of purple gallinules down on the river basin in Mahaka.
All right, thank you. I've got a very long list that my sister's given me because she's been out here. Both my brother and sister live out here, so she's got a long list lined up for me. I'm not a great bird photographer, but of course you can't miss the opportunity when you come to places like this.
David Dixon can help you because he's an expert in that. David?
Sorry?
You are an expert about photography. You can help him with that, with the list.
I know, it's just, like I say, I have an oriole nest every year just behind the house. Just now it's jays. Oh, me. The jays, I have a little feed and a hide up in the woods and the jays have just taken over. It's just jay after jay after jay after jay. You sit in the hide like this, flicking the hide to get them to fly away. You know?